Came here to say a few things, but the chorus that we've had from this stage has been clear. I don't need to repeat that we have the power of choice. Every speaker on this platform has done that. I don't need to repeat that this is the COP that needs action. All of us as a chorus have said that. I don't need to repeat the horror and the devastation wreaked upon this earth over the course of the last 12 months since we met in Glasgow, whether the apocalyptic floods in Pakistan, or the heat waves from Europe to China, or indeed in the last few days in my own region, the devastation caused in Belize by Tropical Storm Lisa, or the torrential floods a few days ago in St. Lucia. We don't need to repeat it because a picture spoke 1,000 words earlier. But what we do need to do is to understand why we are not moving any further. We have the collective capacity to transform. We're in the country that built pyramids. We know what it is to remove slavery from our civilization. We know what it is to be able to find a vaccine within 2 years when a pandemic hits us. We know what it is to put a man on the moon, and now we put in rover on Mars. We know what it is. But the simple political will that is necessary, not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve, seems still not to be capable of being produced. This is immoral and it is unjust. If Glasgow is to deliver on the promises of Paris, it must close these 3 gaps. So I ask to you, what must we say to our people living on the front line in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Pacific, when both ambition and regrettably some of the needed faces at Glasgow are not present? What excuse should we give for the failure? In the words of that Caribbean icon, Eddie Grant, will they mourn us on the front line? When will we, as world leaders across the world, address the pressing issues that are truly causing our people angst and worry, whether it is climate or whether it is vaccines? Simply put, when will leaders lead? Our people are watching, and our people are taking note. And are we really going to leave Scotland without the resolve and the ambition that is sorely needed to save lives and to save our planet? How many more voices and how many more pictures of people must we see on these screens without being able to move? Or are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity? I have been saying to Barbadians for many years that many hands make light work. Today, we need the correct mix of voices, ambition, and action. Do some leaders in this world believe that they can survive and thrive on their own? Have they not learned from the pandemic? Can there be peace and prosperity if 1/3 of the world literally prospers and the other 2/3 of the world live under siege and face calamitous threats to our well-being? What the world needs now, my friends, is that which is within the ambit of less than 200 persons who are willing and prepared to lead. Leaders must not fail those who elect them to lead. And I say to you, there is a sword that can cut down this Gordian knot, and it has been wielded before. The central banks of the wealthiest countries engaged in $25 trillion of quantitative easing in the last 13 years. 25 trillion. Of that, 9 trillion was in the last 18 months to fight the pandemic. Had we used that 25 trillion to purchase bonds, to finance the energy transition, or the transition of how we eat, or how we move ourselves in transport, we would now today be reaching that 1.5 degrees limit that is so vital to us. I say to you today in Glasgow that an annual increase in the SDRs of $500 billion a year for 20 years, put in a trust to finance the transition, is the real gap, Secretary General, that we need to close, not the 50 billion being proposed for adaptation. And if 500 billion sounds big to you, guess what? It is just 2% of the 25 trillion. This is the sword we need to wield. Our excitement 1 hour into this event is far less than it was 6 months ago leading up to this event. Can we, with those voices and these speeches from Sir David and others, find it within ourselves to get the resolve to bring Glasgow back on track? Or do we leave today believing that it was a failure before it starts? Our world, my friends, stands at a fork in the road. One no less significant than when the United Nations was formed in 1945. But then, the majority of our countries here did not exist. We exist now. The difference is we want to exist 100 years from now. And if our existence is to mean anything, then we must act in the interests of all of our people who are dependent on us. And if we don't, we will allow the path of greed and selfishness to sow the seeds of our common destruction. The leaders of today, not 2030, not 2050, must make this choice. It is in our hands, and our people and our planet need it more than ever. We can work with who is ready to go, because the train is ready to leave. And those who are not yet ready, we need to continue to ring circle and to remind them that their people, not our people, but their citizens, need them to get on board as soon as possible. Code red to the G7 countries. Code red to the G20. Earth to COP, that's what it said. Earth to COP. For those who have eyes to see, for those who have ears to listen, and for those who have a heart to feel, 1.5 is what we need to survive. 2 degrees, yes, SG, is a death sentence for the people of Antigua and Barbuda, for the people of the Maldives, for the people of Dominica and Fiji, for the people of Kenya and Mozambique, and yes, for the people of Samoa and Barbados. We do not want that dreaded death sentence. How many more countries must falter, particularly in a world that is now suffering the consequences of war and inflation, and countries therefore are unable to meet the challenges of finding the necessary resources to finance their way to net zero? This world looks still too much like it did when it was part of an imperialistic empire. The global north borrows between interest rates of between 1% to 4%. The global south of 14%. And then we wonder why the just energy partnerships are not working. Similarly, we ask ourselves if countries that want to finance their way to net zero and want to do the right thing can't get the critical supplies, will they not have to rely again on natural gas as that clean bridge? This is the bald reality. And we have come here to ask us to open our minds to different possibilities. We believe that we have a plan. We believe that there can be the establishment of a climate mitigation trust that unlocks $5 trillion of private sector savings if we can summon the will to use the SDRs, 500 billion of SDRs, special drawing rights, in a way that unlocks the private sector capital. We believe that that requires a change in the attitude of Congress, because the agreement that establishes the International Monetary Fund requires 85% to change that agreement. And if the United States government has 17% of the quota, then it can't be done, Mr. Gore, without your Congress. Similarly, we accept that there was and must be a commitment to unlocking concessional funding for climate vulnerable countries. There is no way that developing countries who have been graduated can fight this battle without access to concessional funding. We heard it on this stage from the head of my old alma mater at LSE. We believe that it is critical that we address the issue of loss and damage. The talk must come to an end. And I'd like to salute Denmark and Belgium and Scotland for their own modest ways of trying to accept the precepts and principles of loss and damage as critical and as morally just. But for loss and damage to work, we believe that it can't only be an issue of asking state parties to do the right thing, although they must. But we believe that the non-state actors and the stakeholders, the oil and gas companies, and those who facilitate them need to be brought into a special convocation between now and COP28. How do companies make $200 billion in profits in the last 3 months and not expect to contribute at least 10 cents in every dollar of profit to a loss and damage fund? This is what our people expect. And I ask us, as we reflect on what a loss and damage fund can look like and who should access it, that we convene a special convocation that doesn't only involve state parties, but non-state actors such as the same companies. We believe as well that the time has come for the introduction of natural disaster and pandemic clauses in our debt instruments. I have said that if Barbados is hit tomorrow, because we have natural disaster clauses, God forbid if we are hit tomorrow, we unlock 18% of GDP over the next 2 years, because what we do is effectively put a pause on all of our debt and put it at the end for 2 years and put it at the end, and we pay back that money at the end. But what we get is the flexibility in the first 2 years to address issues of damage and loss. And finally, we believe that the multilateral development banks have to reform. Yes, it is time for us to revisit Bretton Woods. Yes, it is time for us to remember that those countries who sit in this room today did not exist at the time that the Bretton Woods institutions were formed for the most part. And therefore we have not seen, we have not been heard sufficiently. And if we are therefore to rise to the occasion, to play our part to stop the tragic loss of life that we have seen on these screens and the impact on livelihoods that we are feeling across our countries, then there needs to be a new deal with respect to the Bretton Woods institutions. And we need to ensure that they have a different view to their risk appetite, that we look at the SDRs, and that we look at other innovative ways to expand the lending that is available from billions to trillions. My friends, the time is running out on us. And yes, we have the power of choice. When asked what should he do when he became president of South Africa? Should he pursue a path of vengeance, or should he seek to build a state? Nelson Mandela chose to be able to build a state and to keep a country together. He chose blessings instead of curse because he believed that it would make a defining difference. When given the choice of how to treat to post-war Europe, President Truman settled the Marshall Plan that made the definable difference to the countries that were responsible, yes, for the destruction of so much and for the loss of life of so many. But in spite of that, they chose to rise above it. I ask us today, what will our choice be? We have the power to act or the power to remain passive and do nothing. I pray that we will leave Egypt with a clear understanding that the things that are facing us today are all interconnected. I thank President El-Sisi for his comments that there needs to be peace, because countries like ours continue to suffer as a result of a war that we have no part of, and a war that we want to see come to an end. Our people on this earth deserve better, and what is more, our leaders know better. Because while many of us may not have been alive during the great wars, the consequences of those wars still live with us.
The elephant in the room, what a lot of Western climate diplomats tell me, is that leaders like yourself also carry a responsibility. Why are vulnerable countries still so debt-stricken? Why is there still corruption? What is your response to that?
You really want me to answer you?
I do.
Okay. Why is it that every time we talk about countries from the South, the first allegation is corruption? Last time I checked, in the USA and the UK and Europe, they're riddled with corruption, but nobody says that they're not capable of achieving their objectives because of corruption. Why is it that we're not talking about the fact that these countries became independent, having allowed those countries that colonized them to extract significant portions of their wealth, such that we had no proper housing, no proper education, no proper healthcare systems, no proper legal systems, no proper across the whole stream, and certainly nothing to do with building social capital like community development and cultural enterprises. And what has happened is therefore that we have spent the time since independence trying to give our people what the global north has taken for granted and has supported by the extrication of centuries of wealth to give their people out of our blood, sweat and tears. Now, when our blood, sweat and tears finances the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution then causes the climate crisis, and then I have to pay for the consequences of the climate crisis because of the Industrial Revolution financed by our blood, sweat and tears, then I think they have no moral authority to tell me anything about the financing of the climate or about why we don't have enough.
Is it anger over this that fuels your energy?
Anger? Absolutely not. Unfairness, lack of justice. They're not angry. I'm just disappointed that humankind still wants to believe that there's one world for a set of people and another world for another set.
Mia Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados, stood before the world leaders at COP27. Her presence was a beacon of hope for many, a symbol of resilience and determination. She wasn't there to whisper. She was there to make a statement, to ensure that the voices of the vulnerable were heard loud and clear. She was there to raise her voice, to amplify the cries of those who have been ignored for far too long, to speak for those who couldn't, for the marginalized, the forgotten, and the overlooked, for the small island nations swallowed by rising seas. These nations, though small in size, face monumental challenges as they battle the relentless encroachment of the ocean. For communities ravaged by storms and droughts, these are the people who bear the brunt of climate change, their lives upended by forces beyond their control. Motley's message was clear. The climate crisis is a crisis of justice. It is a call to action for the world to recognize the inequities that have led us here. This wasn't just another speech. It was a clarion call, a plea for immediate and decisive action. This was a roar of frustration, a demand for accountability, a challenge to the world leaders to step up and take responsibility. Motley, a powerful voice for the global South, challenged the status quo. She urged for a rethinking of global priorities, emphasizing the need for solidarity and support. She pointed her finger at the historical injustices, the broken promises, and the continued inaction that has pushed our planet to the brink. Her words were a stark reminder of the urgency of the situation. Her words resonated far beyond the conference halls. They struck a chord with many, igniting a sense of urgency and determination. They echoed in the streets where climate activists marched. These activists, inspired by Motley's words, took to the streets to demand change. They found their way into the homes of families struggling to survive, families who have seen their livelihoods destroyed by the changing climate. Motley's speech was a wake-up call, a reminder that we are running out of time. It was a call to action, urging everyone to come together and fight for a sustainable future. Motley didn't mince words. Her voice echoed through the hall, resonating with a sense of urgency and a call for justice. She placed the blame squarely where it belonged, on the shoulders of the wealthy nations, the architects of this crisis. These nations, with their vast resources and technological advancements, had the power to change the course of history but chose not to. European powers, with their centuries of industrialization, bore the brunt of her criticism. The relentless pursuit of progress and profit during the Industrial Revolution had set the stage for the environmental catastrophe we face today. Their factories, fueled by coal and oil, had released the carbon that now threatened to drown entire nations. The smoke that once symbolized progress now loomed as a harbinger of doom for vulnerable communities around the globe. But it wasn't just about emissions. The environmental degradation was a symptom of a much deeper malaise. Motley exposed the deep-rooted legacy of colonialism. The exploitation of resources, the forced labor, and the systemic oppression of indigenous populations were all part of a larger narrative of exploitation and injustice. The systematic extraction of wealth from the global South, all of it had contributed to the climate crisis. The scars of colonialism were not just historical, they were etched into the very fabric of our current environmental challenges. And now the very nations that had profited from this destruction were turning their backs on those who were paying the price. The cries for help from the global South were met with indifference and inaction. Motley's words were a searing indictment of historical amnesia. She called out the selective memory of those in power, who conveniently forgot the roots of the crisis while reaping its benefits. She reminded the world that the climate crisis wasn't some unfortunate accident. It was a man-made disaster, a consequence of deliberate choices and policies that prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability. It was the direct result of choices made by those in power, choices that were often made behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny, choices driven by greed and a disregard for the well-being of others. The pursuit of profit at any cost had led to a world on the brink of ecological collapse, and Motley's speech was a clarion call for accountability and change. The Paris Agreement, signed with much fanfare in 2015, promised a new era of climate action. Leaders from around the globe gathered, united by a common goal to combat climate change and protect our planet for future generations. The agreement was hailed as a monumental step forward, a beacon of hope in a world increasingly threatened by environmental degradation. Yet, years later, the gap between rhetoric and reality couldn't be wider. The promises made with such enthusiasm have largely fallen by the wayside, overshadowed by political inaction and economic interests. The pristine visions of a sustainable future stand in stark contrast to the polluted, deteriorating state of our current environment. Motley called out the empty promises, the insufficient financial support, and the continued investment in fossil fuels. Her voice echoed the frustrations of many who have watched as leaders talk the talk but fail to walk the walk. The climate summits, filled with grand speeches and ambitious targets, often end with little to no concrete action. The $100 billion a year pledged to developing nations to help them adapt to climate change? It was a lifeline for those most vulnerable, a promise of support and solidarity. But in reality, this financial aid has been a mere trickle, far from the flood of resources that was promised. A fraction of what was needed, and even that meager sum remained largely undelivered. The empty offices and the small piles of coins on cracked earth are a stark reminder of the broken promises and the dire need for real, substantial support. Meanwhile, wealthy nations continued to pour trillions into subsidizing the very industries that were fueling the crisis. The industrial smokestacks and oil rigs are not just symbols of progress, but also of the relentless exploitation of our planet's resources. These subsidies perpetuate a cycle of destruction, making it even harder to transition to a sustainable future. Motley's message was clear. This wasn't just about a lack of political will. It was a call to recognize the deeper, systemic issues at play. The determined expressions on the faces of delegates reflect the gravity of the situation, but determination alone is not enough. It was about a fundamental failure to grasp the scale and urgency of the crisis. The ticking clock and the frantic actions of emergency responders highlight the limited time we have to act. Every second counts, and the longer we delay, the more severe the consequences will be. It was about a system rigged against those who had the least, a system that prioritized short-term profits over the long-term survival of humanity. The protests and the signs demanding climate justice are a cry for a fairer, more equitable world, a world where the needs of the many are not sacrificed for the gains of the few. The United States, the world's largest historical emitter, didn't escape Motley's scrutiny. She lamented the erratic nature of US climate policy, swinging wildly between engagement and denial depending on who occupied the White House. The Trump years, with their outright climate denial and withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, had dealt a major blow to global efforts. While Biden's return to the accord offered a glimmer of hope, Motley stressed that pledges without concrete action were meaningless. She criticized the US for its tendency to point fingers at developing nations for their rising emissions, ignoring their right to development and their minuscule contribution to the problem compared to the historical emissions of wealthy nations. Section 5. Europe's empty gestures. European leaders, often eager to present themselves as climate champions, also faced Motley's sharp rebuke. She accused them of hypocrisy, urging developing nations to transition to renewable energy while continuing to invest in fossil fuels at home and abroad. Motley denounced the double standards, the failure to meet financial commitments, and the prioritization of geopolitical concerns over the existential threat of climate change. The war in Ukraine, while a tragedy, couldn't be an excuse for inaction. The climate crisis, she reminded them, was a global crisis that demanded a united front. At the heart of Motley's speech lay a fundamental principle: climate justice. Those who had contributed the least to the problem were bearing the brunt of the consequences. This injustice, she argued, had to be addressed. Motley called for a radical overhaul of the global financial system. She demanded debt relief for developing nations struggling to cope with climate impacts. She urged for the creation of new mechanisms to address loss and damage, to compensate countries like her own for the irreversible harm they were suffering. This wasn't about charity, she insisted. It was about accountability. It was about recognizing the interconnectedness of our world and understanding that the fate of one nation was intertwined with the fate of all. Motley's critique extended beyond individual nations. She condemned the short-sightedness of global leadership, more concerned with clinging to power than tackling the defining challenge of our time. The lack of accountability was appalling. The broken promises, the unmet targets, the continued prioritization of profit over people, it all pointed to a systemic failure to grasp the urgency of the situation. Motley's message was clear. The world needed new leadership, leaders who were willing to listen to the science, to act with courage, and to prioritize the well-being of all over the enrichment of a few. Motley's speech wasn't just a condemnation of the status quo, it was a rallying cry for change. Her words resonated with activists and communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, amplifying their demands for justice and action. Her message transcended national borders. uniting people from all walks of life in a shared fight for a livable future. Motley's voice became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope could be found in collective action and unwavering determination. Mia Motley's COP27 speech marked a pivotal moment in the global climate movement. Her powerful words, imbued with moral clarity and a fierce sense of urgency, forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truths of climate injustice. Whether her call to action would be heeded remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: Motley had shifted the conversation. She had exposed the hypocrisy, the inaction, and the systemic failures that were driving us toward a climate catastrophe. Her speech was a wake-up call, a reminder that the time for empty promises was over. The time for action was now.